Okay, so today is Monday, November the 21st, just before Turkey Day, Thanksgiving. So before I forget to tell you all, have a blessed Thanksgiving. Enjoy the family. These are precious times, to be together as families. So let work have a little hiatus for a while is my advice. Okay, work will always be there. All right, so today we're going to cover everything to do with leases and the forms that are used with leases. So we'll do as much as we can in an hour and a half. I'm not going to keep you over, nor am I going to stay over because I got other things I have to do here before I leave. Today's my last day in the office for this month, and then we're headed out to Nashville tomorrow, and then back to Charlotte on the weekend. So we'll cover the forms that are used in the landlord end of things and also on the tenant end of things. Now, those of you that have joined before, you're going to know a lot of these forms. I'm not going to go into detail on some of the ones that are in like every form set. So the main things we'll focus on the exclusive right to lease, and then some of the tenant forms like tenant agency and things like that. So we'll get started. I will. So we're going to save the lease to last. I could chew up the whole hour and a half on that. I just want to highlight things. So let's open up the, and these are in no semblance of order. So we in DocuSign and Remind, we have the whole landlord group of forms in one set, and we have the tenant group of forms in another set. So quite often you'll be, you could represent both sides, and which time, you have to have two opportunities when that happens. You can't lump them under one because probably at that point you've signed a tenant agency agreement. Now this is similar to our buyer's agency agreement. It's more simplified, but the same basis to establish a relationship between you and the client. So I should fill out the whole top part as needed. You would be representing the tenant as their exclusive agent. And then, the listings are always with the brokerage. So even though you procure the listing with the client somehow, but it tilts always technically belong to the brokerage once they're under contract. And obviously you do that for a number of reasons to get broker support and or legal support as needed. So that's part of it. So when you're, again, much more simplified than the buyer's agency agreement, you're going to put your term on, and I would focus on doing 6 months here too, minimum of 6 months. There's more inventory out there now than there has been. I've got currently 3 leases on the market, both what I would call high-end leases from $2,500 and up, and they're sitting. They're not getting hardly any showings. Not a whole lot of internet traffic either from the different sites. So the market, again, even in the rental market, has shifted. The rental market was even hotter than the resale market in the spring and summer, just from lack of inventory. But again, everybody's kind of in a sit and wait mode, and so you kind of ride these things out and not have to move if they don't have to move. So that's why, give yourself at least 6 months here. I don't like a year because a lot can happen in a year, and maybe that your whole relationship goes south and you don't want to work with that client anymore. So don't be contractually obligated to do that. Give yourself a little bit of an out. If you're confident you might be able to find a place, I don't know if you could do it in 90 days. It's going to be tough to find something in 90 days, but 60 days is good to work here. So then it talks about, the tenant's responsibility, and talks about the landlord's responsibility. And these are more generic, non-discriminatory. Of course, everything we ever do in real estate, is fair housing. And, I've mentioned this before in other classes, but this part of the business gets mystery shopped. There are people that are hired by the state of Michigan to pose as tenants and will call listings and ask certain questions to see how you answer them. This is done on a national scale. It's done locally. It's done via the state, predominantly in Michigan. And they're going to ask you some poignant questions and how you answer those. So you have to be careful of that. I would say, listen, you never know who's on the other end of that phone, ever, right? So be careful what you say, be careful how you see it, and always follow the golden rule and the code of ethics, and you can't go wrong. So if somebody says, I want to go see houses in, they're basically south of 8 Mile, let's say, and that could be something that maybe you're not comfortable with, or you don't want to do that, and that's maybe not your book of business, and you have every right to say that. But at the same time, you're going to say, listen, we have agents in our office that can help you that do a book of business there. I just don't venture there you don't have to give them really all the reasons, but as long as you're consistent with your verbiage that you're translating back to the person on the other end of the phone. Somebody says, well, do you take Section 8? And a landlord has the right to say, no, I don't want to take Section 8. Now, I was a landlord on and off for almost 40 years. I loved taking anything with social assistance because it pretty much locked in the tenant for the first year. And they were getting that. They couldn't say they didn't have the money because they were getting the money from the government, right? So, and also with that, you get now it's like a mini inspection. Section 8 will come out and inspect the home to make sure it's livable, make sure there are no major issues there. So that kind of gives you a little like a clean bill of health that from that point moving forward, the house was in good shape, good enough to get approved by Section 8. So at the same time, most cities, require a rental certification. They're going to require that rental to be registered with the city, pay an appropriate fee to be a landlord in that city, and at the same time, it gets inspected by the city. They will come out and inspect that property for condition, outside, inside, mechanicals, everything, garage, you name it. They're going to check it out. They're going to check it out pretty good, and they will issue violations, at which point the landlord should be correcting those violations. So periodically there'll be kind of a landlord that doesn't do that. And, that's not a good thing as a landlord for liability reasons. If you purposely don't get your rental permit. The other thing is if you ever go to court, that's probably one of the first questions the judge is going to ask you. And if you say no, they're going to throw out your case. They're not even going to listen to you because you need to go and get it. It's a moneymaker for the city. It's a peace of mind for the tenant. And it also is somewhat peace of mind for the landlord because I liked it. When my last property was in Warren, the city came in every 2 years. I paid my $150. It's all built into fixed expenses. It should be built into your rent, right? And I get a certificate of occupancy. So that tenant can't come back and say that I was negligent in any way, or I was, my house was dilapidated, or I wasn't fixing things because, hey, as of this date, when you moved in, everything was perfect. So I think, it's a nice kind of stamp of approval from the city that the house is in good shape. So you can always look for that when you're on the tenant side. You can ask that question of the listing broker. Is it certified? Is it registered with the city? City of Detroit requires it. It's one of the few inspections they're requiring, no more pre-sale. But you have to be registered, pay the fee, get inspected, and they will come out and find something wrong. They always do, and that's okay. Fix those things that are wrong, and at least you're making the effort. They can see you're making the effort. But I'm going to tell you from experience, if you try to fight that and you try to push back, it's only going to get worse. They're going to come out again or send somebody else out, and they're going to find more things wrong, and it's going to be not fun. So typically when they do that inspection, you just take it, do what you got to do, make the repairs, and consider it a win. And then we're going to get everybody's signature on here. Pretty simple document. Okay. Now, if you got questions anytime, just go ahead, open your mic and ask me. I'm not going to ask if there's questions at the end of every forum. Okay. We just keep it moving. So same thing here. We got, even in the lease portion, we're going to have an affiliated business agreement because now we're going to see, different, sometimes there's title companies involved in these. Sometimes we're going to ask the title company to do a search. and make sure that that landlord is the landlord, the actual owner of the property. And this stuff happens, unfortunately, there's a decent amount of fraud in this part of the business too, where people pose as landlords. You'll see a lot of quick scams on Craigslist. They'll take an active listing this happened to me last year. They take an active listing on the MLS. Let's say it's in Royal Oak. I'm running it out at $2,000 a month. They'll throw it in Craigslist for $1,000 a month. Well, everybody sees that, they get all excited. Oh, it's great rent, and if they don't do their homework, and they're dealing with, a criminal on the other end that's fabricating this whole transaction, they've gone as far as giving them first month's rent and security deposit, thinking they can secure the property. So bottom line is, it's not theirs. They don't have access to it. How people are renting them sight unseen, I don't know. But so this is, acknowledging that we have these relationships, and your goal always is to convert that tenant into a buyer, right? That's part of the reason for taking these. And I've been very fortunate in my real estate career to do a lot of business with leases, and in particular down here in downtown Royal Oak. I inherited an agent's portfolio that was fired by the broker, not a kid of you, before I came here, for doing things they shouldn't be doing. And so I inherited their portfolio, which included some loft clients down here in Royal Oak. And then I expanded on that over the years. And our office does actually a lot of loft business. There's half a dozen agent here to do some decent loft business consistently. So it's been extremely good for me. I've had 3 landlords since 2006. So I've been leasing their place on and off all during that time. About half of them, or more, I had 10 at one point, have sold. They sold during the right time. I was encouraging them to sell, actually. The 2 that hung in there, or 3 that hung in there, didn't listen. And now they're going to regret it, because with the influx of all these apartments that came into Royal Oak in the last 3 years, it's a lot more difficult to lease some of these condos. So anyway, that's the spiel for the lenders. The insurance. Most landlords should require renter's insurance, and Aaron at Farm Bureau can supply that. I had it when I was renting my apartment for a year after we sold our house. He did a great job. It gives you car, auto, casualty, whatever. He does it all. And then home warranty usually don't get involved with during the course of a lease, but could be, depending on what the lease and the burden that they put on the tenant. So make sure you're filling this out with every lease as well for compliance. If you don't, you won't get paid. So these are just the good habits to get into when you're here. These forms that are mandated, they're part of every transaction, and there's no harm. But so never send those to the other side either. These, the forms that are only tenant specific or landlord specific, just stay within your opportunity here, your room of documents. Just keep it there. The only thing you'll need to send is some of the stuff we're going to talk about here in a minute. And the other one that's a generic form that's, again, used with every transaction we do is the disclosure of agency. So we need to let the other side know who we're working for. We would think it's pretty simple. Well, I'm bringing you a tenant, that I'm working for you. If I'm working with a landlord, I'm working with a landlord, obviously. But we need to put it to paper. So this form we use for whatever we're doing: landlord, tenant, buy, sell, or transaction coordinator, which you're basically a neutral party. You're not a listing agent, and you're not a buyer's agent. You're kind of quarterbacking the transaction to the finish line. That's a transaction coordinator, and it's a nice way to pick up some money with not getting having to have the expense of putting up a listing or trucking around town with a buyer. So typically somebody will come to you with, hey, I need some help. I'm going to sell my house, or friend, family, some kind of acquaintance, or somebody referred them to you. And you can, do that. You can act like the neutral party. So you're Switzerland, maybe Switzerland not so neutral now, but you're the monkey in the middle, whatever. You're there to assist each side to close the transaction. So just check the appropriate box, whether you're a tenant or you're a landlord. In this case, get everybody to sign it. If you have both sides, make them sign the same document. Okay. So you would be, you would represent the tenant and the landlord. It's nice when you get both sides of a lease, especially when it's a hardier lease, some good rents. So here is the commencement inventory checklist. This is mandated. This is a statute that should be in every lease. That the tenant is to receive 2 copies of this form. You actually have to, either email or hand it to them to fill out, and they have 7 days to fill it out. Okay, not at the move-in. They've got 7 days, because the move-in could be chaotic. There's a lot of stuff going on. Maybe that's the first time the landlord and the tenant meet at the house, and typically that's what happens now with the internet, because they're not, that's the first time they meet at the house. And then the landlord will explain, their rules and how they want things handled and how they're going to have payments and so forth. And then the tenant has a week to basically go through the house and kind of observe and write down anything they think's wrong with it. So that would be the beginning condition. And again, then they have to share a copy of that with their agent and with the other party then, so that the landlord has a copy. So typically the landlord would receive this and walk through or talk to the tenant regarding these issues, so that everybody's on the same page. So there's no gray area that, well, that wasn't there before, now it's there, that you did that while you were there. And because we have, some unscrupulous landlords too that will try to use up security deposit for damages that were pre-existing. So here's what, your role as the agent, right? So you're there at the final walkthrough, whatever side you're on. A good practice to do is let the 2 meet, talk, and while they're doing that, go around and take a set of pictures. Okay, even take a video, and then send it to your landlord or send it to your tenant, so you can establish condition as much as possible on the data. 7 days. Now, so this is statute. It has to be, there's verbiage in the lease, and I'll show you where this has to be given, and 2 copies, has to be 2 copies, and within 7 days, hopefully get it back. Now, what happens if I don't get it back in 7 days? What's the obligation? Well, if I'm the landlord, I'm thinking, well, everything's fine. I don't have to chase you down. Everybody's adults. Everybody can read. If you don't return it within 7 days, then the assumption is that everything's fine. You don't have any issues, which is okay. I mean, that happens. Sometimes places are really nice and you don't have to write anything down. But if I'm the tenant, I'm writing everything down that I can, that I think is wrong with the house. So the landlord might already know these conditions, but if they don't, you need to call it out so that you're not charged for it when you're exiting the lease. So you would use the same form when you exit and fill in any kind of repairs. Or so you go over this with the landlord, they walk the place. If I'm a landlord, I'm walking the house after I receive this. So there's no gray area. We want to make sure that everybody's in agreement as to condition. A pretty powerful form when it's filled out correctly. So, what happens if I get it after 21 days? Well, you take the form, and then if I'm the landlord, I'm like, wait a minute, why did it take so long? Okay, and we're going to walk through this, because some of that might have happened when you moved in, or since you've moved in, that wasn't there before. So you want to make, if I'm a landlord, I'm going to make sure I check those out. But according to the statute, you got 7 days. All right. So either side can supply that form. Okay, I have it as an attachment on my listings, so it's already there, so that if somebody's going to make an offer, they can always upload that and give it to their tenant. Then we've got COVID stuff here. We're not going to open those up, save some time. We're not requiring any COVID documents now, but it's good conversation to have with the landlord and the tenant about the risks of COVID in the marketplace and showing properties. Next, we've got the exclusive right to sell. So this is the most important document, obviously, when you're putting up a listing. It's very similar to the exclusive right to sell. This is the exclusive right to lease. Top portion self-explanatory. The date that you're filling out the document would go here, and then here again, try to give yourself at least 6 months of a listing contract to lease the property. I mean, I'm 3 months into one of them already, and I don't think there's any sign of this thing leasing anytime soon. And there's just not a lot of activity in the whole downtown Royal Oak area now. Again, because we have an influx of apartments. We probably had over 500 apartments come on into the market in the last 3 years, let alone all the loss that were here before. So give yourself at least 6 months, fill this out appropriately. And then there are, similar to when we have a sale, items in the house, make sure if the landlords, they're going to keep those, they're going to take them. So a lot of times it's the landlord is the previous occupant or the owner of the home that now has chosen to rent their home because maybe they might be coming back in a couple of years, whatever their work assignment, things like that, or going back overseas for a couple of years, and then coming back here. So we talk about, the fixtures that are in the home and what should be left, what shouldn't be left. And this is just between us and the landlord. And if there's any kind of an exclusion, then we need to put that in the listing, the actual listing itself under the agent tab. Now with leases, there is no seller disclosure is not required. You don't fill out a seller disclosure with the lease, but you do fill out lead-based paint again with every transaction. And then the amount of the rent, with whatever you're going to decide on with the landlord. And typically here would be, per month, how much is the rent? And in Michigan, the other statute is that you can only charge 1.5 months security maximum. You can charge less, which I never would encourage a landlord to take less, because that's never a good sign. If somebody's beating you up to say, I can't give you 1.5 months, then that's probably not going to be good moving forward with that particular tenant, based on my experience. So I would hold my guns always to get 1.5 months, because inevitably somewhere along the line, you're going to have probably more damage than 1.5 months. At least you've got that money to, keep it up front and then sue them for the balance. But sometimes, again, they're not collectible. So that all sounds great, but the reality is they're not collectible. So make sure that you're encouraging the landlord to retain 1.5 months security deposit. Commission typically is 1 month's rent that will be split between the two brokerages. Now, we do not have a spot in here for a compliance fee. That's something I'm going to be adding in the near future when I revise this form. We added it to the tenants form where you can charge an additional compliance fee, and that's discretionary. That's kind of dictates basically on the volume of the listing. So I always say if something's less than, let's say, $1,500, by the time you split that, you got $750. By the time you split that with the office, there's not a whole lot of money left. And I get it. But why do I even bother to do these? Well, the reason you do these is because you get a client. And the client's going to bring you more business if you do what you're supposed to be doing for that client. And a lot of tenants really appreciate the effort when you're busting your butt trying to find them a place, because they know you're not making a lot of money on this. And hopefully, again, and from my experience, this has been very beneficial that tenant becomes future business, whether it's that tenant themselves or they refer you to someone that's friends or family. And that's how you get kickstarted, and that's how you survive in this business, because even though you didn't get rich on this transaction, you will have some residual good things happen as a result of it, as long as everything goes smooth and everybody's happy. So, and they should, as long as you're doing what you should be doing. So commission is 1 month's rent to be split 50-50 between the two brokerages. You can add here, even though we don't have it, we have a section, with additional comments that put it in here, that the landlord will be charged a broker compliance fee of, let's say, $200. So again, the beauty of our office is the compliance fees, for the most part, flow to the agent, right? So if you're charging $295 on a sale, you're getting $195 and the office gets $100. On a lease, you're going to get the whole amount. because we don't require a broker compliance fee on a lease. It's discretionary. So it's another way to make a few extra bucks. You can't be, again, you have to be consistent in this business so that it's not discriminatory with, well, I'm charging, $100 per $1,000 rent, whatever. Somewhere I have a history with this is what I've done in the past. So you can't say I'm gouging somebody, and then you come to find out there's some type of minority, and then we got all kind of problems. So be consistent when you're talking about compliance fees, but it's another way to make a few extra bucks, which is okay. Again, because I understand, and we all understand that you don't make a lot of money on some of these leases. Anything under $1,500 is, I would be charging an additional amount. Now, the leases that I have for $2,000, $2,500, I have one now. I have one for $3,500, and I have another one for $3,700. Houses in Bloomfield. I don't charge those guys compliance fees because it's a pretty good commission. And with leases, more so than sales, there's more of an opportunity to catch both sides because a lot of agents don't want to do them. So that they'll just tell the client, just call the listing agent and tell them you want to see the property. And so you need to still ask the same questions. Are you working with, on the buy side, right? On the tenant side, are you working with anybody? Been shown any homes like we have in the, so that you're not wasting your time and then somebody's just going to jump ship and put their offer in with somebody else. They're offered a lease. So 1 month's commission, 1.5 months security. Now, if a tenant has damaged credit, the tenant can suggest more rent up front. So tenant can say, like, listen, you pull my credits, it's going to be bad. It's 500. I had a tough street, but when you look at their employment history, the guy's been working the same job for 12 years. He makes good money, obviously afford it, but he's just got a lousy credit. So with that, you can say, okay, great. Let's do 3 months up front. Let's do 6 months up front for the tenant to make it more attractive for the landlord. Now, there's always risk with that, but not a lot because they've changed how this all works. But there was a point where during the previous recession, when we're things are hitting the brakes a little bit. We're not using the R word yet, but in 2008 to 12, there were many, many landlords that defaulted on their mortgages because they were doing buy, sell, pull the equity out, buy another house, pull the equity out, buy another house. And then when values plummeted, they were, in the negative in most of these and weren't making their payments. Meanwhile, they've got a tenant inside of a home. And here's a tenant doing everything right, paying their rent on time, paid their security deposit, and the landlord was not paying the mortgage. So they default, right? And the tenant's in the house. And back then we would, part of what I used to do with foreclosures is we'd offer cash for keys. So here's a tenant that did nothing wrong, and all of a sudden's got to move again. So that's pretty heartbreaking. But now they've changed the rules. If there's a legitimate lease in place and they have a signed copy of a lease, it's executed, you got a date, you got to start at the beginning, you got an ending, right? Then the bank or whoever's foreclosing on it must honor the lease that's in place. They cannot evict. And this happened more than you want to know. And then the other part with, like I said, with the scammers, I'm also a HUD listing broker, right? So I'm listing HUD homes, which are distressed assets, but scattered throughout the metro area, not just in depressed areas. And that was a big scam where people were posing as landlords, again, on the internet, Craigslist, whatever, even Facebook, was reduced rates and securing tenants. And then once upon a time, the keys were a little easier for people to get. They would even turn the key over to the tenant, and the tenant would move in. And then I'd go to do my twice a month check on the property, make sure it's secure and everything. And here's somebody living in it. I'm like, so they're like, yeah, we just rented this place. I'm like, well, we got a problem. It's not your house and not their house. So those aren't fun. And then you got to go to eviction court. But and HUD will not honor the lease because it was done illegally. So anyway, read this stuff here. We also talk about, let me backtrack a little bit here. So the commission, you would put in 1 month's rent. Okay. Try not to put the amount because you might be reducing the amount. So this stays intact. You can also write it in the section where you can type in that, exactly what you're doing here, that the rent is $2,000 a month. It should be split 50-50 between the two brokerages. A little more defined explanation. We don't, if somebody screws up on a lease, there's just not a lot of money of it to take anybody to court and do anything regarding commissions. It doesn't happen too often, very, very few times. We do have a provision too that if a tenant came back who saw the property prior, while you had it under the listing, you'd still be due a commission. Again, also hard to prove, right? A default in the event, similar to if there's something happened during the course of the lease. And I've had it here where, we filled out all the forms, everybody's done everything they should be doing. And then when it came time to move in, the tenant changed their mind. So once you sign the lease, it's a contract, just like anything else, even though it might not start for another 2 weeks or whatever. It's still a contract. And if you're going to break the contract, there's consequences when you break the contract. So provision in here where if there was the deposit was to be forfeited, that the owner would get so much percentage of that deposit. So again, typically when I always say, like on a listing, when it's friends and family, I'll put a 0 here. If it's somebody I don't know, a stranger, I'll put 50%. So at least I can recoup something of that deposit for my wear and tear, because by this time, maybe the deal goes south. Maybe the landlord doesn't want to work with you anymore, and you don't want to work with the landlord. Maybe it was a landlord's problem why it defaulted. So just read the rest of this. This is where we talk about multi-list cooperation. There is not a spot where, so I'll be adding that in the next part too, where we would put 1/2 a month, 1 month's rent. But this is just to inform the landlord that, we are working with other brokers to secure your property, and we do split the lease proceeds 50-50. So, so they don't think you get all the money, and then you got to remind them, like, listen, I work for a brokerage, and then, I have to split with my brokerage too. So they don't think you're getting the whole half of it. It's not a lot of money in a lot of cases, but different people have perceptions on how this is all supposed to work. So when they really realize that what you're really getting and netting from these, they realize it's not a lot of money. We talk about signs. Most of the signs are geared for sale. There are riders that you can buy to put on the signs that say for lease. GMAR sells the riders really reasonable for a post in the ground. Depending on where you get your signs from, they will have riders that say for lease on them. So it's good to, if your sign says for sale, then for sure you want to put a for lease on there, just so people know it's not for sale as well. It's good to have the rider. People in the office have them. You can borrow one probably. If you put it out on Facebook, somebody will probably let you borrow theirs if you don't have one or don't want to get one. But at GMAR, they're rider. And then we'll talk about lock boxes. Again, I encourage everyone to put an electronic lock box on any listing you can. It's just really, really good because you know exactly when somebody opens that box, and that obviously would probably go into the home at that point, but only licensed realtors can open the box with the app, because the app is all, now there's a double security feature on there too. So it's really comforting, especially when something's occupied, that you use these electronic lock boxes. So those you would get from me. I've got a couple now, but RealComp will not assign them to you until you have the listing partially saved in the MLS or live on the MLS if you've never gotten one before. So we don't have a lot to go around. I always have to be begging for these things back from other agents. They dispersed these like 3 years ago to the office. And it was based on the inventory that agents had on hand at the time. Some agents use them, some never use them, but they're still holding on to them. So it's about time I got to beg for some more because I only got 2. But if I've got it, you can get one. If you need an older or regular style lockbox, I've got actually a few of those to sell. I'm trying to clean up stuff, a little bit of my own stuff. I had way too many of these. So I've got some lockboxes to sell, the old style. And then, again, generic stuff here, nothing crazy. And then, are you current on your mortgage? These are questions we've added as a result of the previous, recession that we went through and some of the things that were happening in the marketplace. Again, this is a contract. It can only be broken by mutual consent in writing. So we get to those times where things are a little rough. Landlord's like, what the heck are you doing for me? I used to rent this out in 2 weeks. I just had this conversation, right? And I said, well, we're in a different marketplace right now. You can see, he gets copied on all the showing requests. He gets the data from the various websites I send him, from realtor.com, from Zillow. You can see the hits that we're getting from those, and then we're still not getting a tenant. So he sees that you're at least doing your job as much as you can. But the phone's not ringing and people aren't really going out and showing the home. And now we're going to get into the seasons, right? The holiday season. So rentals in particular will slow down because most people aren't going to make a jump during that time. Winterizations, this is critical right now. Exactly, it's 20 some degrees outside in the morning. There's a potential for the pipes to freeze. So we have to have that discussion with the landlord. Okay, if the house is vacant, are you going to winterize the property? God forbid the furnace stops working, or we have a power outage. We have some kind of storm and everybody loses power. Now the furnace isn't on. Meanwhile, you had the water on. That's where we have problems. So typically when a house is vacant, it really behooves the landlord to get it winterized to protect the property. And they will blow out all the plumbing pipes, the water that's in the pipes. They'll drain the hot water tank. They'll drop the meter so that nobody can go on, turn on the water. And this happens, like in some of the distressed assets, bank-owned properties, flood homes, things like that. That's how they winterize. And they winterize year round just because it causes less damage. The water is the culprit, right? Water, we got people, breaking into homes and stealing copper, and they just snap the lines off and, they flood the basement. If the basement doesn't have good drainage, the water will start backing up, and then you got all kind of problems. So have a conversation with the landlord. Hey, everything's working great. The furnace looks like it's fine, but this is a precaution you can take. It's up to you. And then you got to define your role. What's the expectations for you to visit that home? Is the landlord going to be checking it out? Are they local? If they're not local, they're probably going to ask you to do it. And typically you would go by once a week and make sure everything's fine, the house is secure, and the furnace is working in the wintertime. And because sometimes like some of the bank-owned properties, they won't have anything turned on. There will be no heat, so it gets pretty cold inside. There'll be no water for sure. And depending on what type of property it is, there might be electric, there might not be electric. So typically in a condo, some of those things might be on if it's a condo that shares a wall. And sometimes the plumbing system is shared throughout the building. Obviously, they would keep the heat on to protect because of the water that is flowing through the building. But a single family residence, freestanding home, not sharing any common walls, it's good practice between basically October to March that the property gets winterized to protect the property. So we make the landlord sign off on that, so they can't come back and say, well, you never told me that. I didn't know I had to do that, So that's why it's included in here. So authorization, pretty simple. Electronic surveillance, same thing. We need to know if it's being video or audio recorded. We need to know that because we're going to let the other side know in the MLS that they are. Because people, you cannot record without someone's permission, even if it's your own home. And many people do, but that can, be a potential lawsuit. So we have to be mindful of that. Where we're going to put everybody on notice that, and now, in particular, you've got these Ring doorbells that can not only see you, but they can hear what you're saying, and you can actually have two-way communication on some of these. So we just need to know that so that we can let people know they could be being recorded while they're in the property. Again, you would use 21 for, whatever, maybe the property the listing doesn't want to start for 2 weeks, or you're going to take it down between, Thursday of this week till Sunday of this week, because people don't want any showings during Thanksgiving, whatever you could put in here. And then you're just an acknowledgement that you're signed it by all parties. So this is the exclusive right to sell. I'll be working on modifying this and a few things that I just talked about to get it a little more current, based on, I'm always looking at these, like what happens during the course of a transaction that comes to my desk as the broker, so that we can avoid those things from happening again. This is what I use in lieu of an application. It's called expression with intent to lease. So the application that most realtors use is pretty extensive. It's usually 2 pages, and they're asking you all this information. But what we found is, and what we're really encouraging our landlords to do, and I want you to encourage the landlord to do, is to register on one of the third-party websites that screen the tenants for them. And this really helps with the whole discrimination piece. The landlord goes in, creates a profile. These are the criteria that I'm looking for. I'm looking for 625 credit score. I'm looking for 2 years at least at the same job. Looking for X amount of income or debt to income ratios. There's questions they're going to ask when they set up their portfolio, so that any potential applicant that came in is judged on the same criteria. And it's pretty gender friendly, pretty ethnic friendly. It doesn't know any of those things. It's just taking an applicant with what you've taken and put on this information here. So with the expression, the only thing we're really asking that's personal information is we're going to have an email address for the tenant and a phone number. And this is basically our offer on the lease. You say, what do you offer, right? Well, you could offer less. If you've seen a house that's been sitting out there for 60 days, maybe you don't give them full price. Or last spring and summer, you're giving them more because you want to get the house for your tenant. So this is kind of like just defining the terms so that the landlord will get this, see what the basic offer is for 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, whatever it is. Typically the tenant will pay these utilities, and the landlord will pay, if it's a condo, they'll pay the condo dues and typically the water, sewer, and the trash. So this outlines basically your offer without going through the in-depth lease application. So now the landlord takes this form, submits your name, email, and phone number into the database, and it will check out that tenant for $40. Most of them are between $40 and $50. If you've taken the lease class, I have that 5 third-party websites that we encourage the landlords to use and register on. I like all my landlords are on rentapplication.net, all one word, rentapplication.net. Great site, $40. You get 1 credit score, personal landlord tenant, evictions, sexual criminal background. All those things are part of that $40 screening. They'll verify your income, your employment. So that's a pretty good look at a tenant, basically, right, for $40. If it's a co-tenant, I think it's another 20 for the other applicant. But it really takes the whole discrimination piece and neutralizes it pretty effectively. So check it out if you want. If you're ever thinking of becoming a landlord, It's a great site to use. There are others. RealComp has put forth a platform called Rent Spree, and that's when you log into RealComp, it's right on the dashboard. It's an option. It's free. You can use that. Again, there's a number of sites. The ones that I've recommended. Zillow has it. That's something built into their site, but keep in mind, Zillow is a competitor now, so we don't like to encourage doing business with Zillow, to be quite frank. So anyway, this is what you would start the application. When I have a listing, I have this as an attachment on the listing, so that when an agent calls me and said their tenant's interested and they want to make an application, so well, this is how we start the process. Just fill this form out. That's all I need for now. And then once the tenant goes in, pays the fee, which is nice too, because once upon a time we were collecting checks for credit checks, and that was a real pain. It was painful because people would bounce checks on you. People were delaying to get you the check, and you'd go ahead and be a great guy and get it all done, and then they change their mind, and now you're out to $40-50 out of your own pocket because you trusted in somebody doing the right thing. So it's a great way to just start the process. It's not a commitment. It's not a lease. It's not binding in any way. We're just kind of agreeing on the terms before we fill out the rest of the forms. Typically, it's what we do similar to a commercial transaction. We call it a letter of intent, which outlines all the terms of the future purchase. The same thing here, outlining the terms of the lease. Who's going to pay for what? It doesn't get into all the nitty gritty, but that'll be defined later in the lease. So, especially with the intent to lease, you make an attachment included on your listing. Fraud warning, same thing. Landlord, tenant, buy, sell, you will always use a fraud warning. We're going to get more and more wires involved with leases because not everybody has a checking account anymore, right? So we're actually searching for a third-party vendor that can, so we can do those exchanges. Right now, the office is set up for EMDs. It's different. We cannot have wire go into the EMD account because there's a whole paper trail that has to happen with this, and it's a ledger that's also scrutinized by the state of Michigan, so that we have to, if there's ever an audit, we have to show money in, money out, and why. So the lease money cannot be part of our earnest money account. With that process for wiring, because it seems like this is coming more and more. Now, typically what I would suggest is, when we have a lease transaction, we require 3 checks. So one check pays the listing broker, the other check pays the tenant's broker, and the remaining money goes to the landlord. So the half and half the rent goes to each. They need to be certified funds. We will not take a personal check on the beginning of a lease. The landlord who wants to do that down the road with subsequent months, that's fine. But the initial lease, we will get certified funds or a wire. That's it. No personal checks, no cash, none of that. Just bank checks. So that's a little challenging because people don't have bank accounts. So you could do it. The bank charges a fee. But we are looking at that too. There is a way to send it to the office on a with the MCA office how to do that. The other option is too that you would send the landlord's portion for the security deposit, any cleaning fees or any pet fees or anything else that would flow to the landlord. The tenant could technically wire straight to the landlord, and we can set that up. But we need a paper trail for compliance that how things were paid, and have copies of how things were paid so that you can get paid at the end. We need to have, so you make copies of the checks whenever you're giving them out. If you represent the tenant and the tenant's coming in with the 3 checks, make a copy of all 3, and then whatever way the listing of the the listing agent or the tenant's agent is who's ever going to get the other side of the transaction, who's going to pick up their check, or you want it mailed or whatever. The office can do that if it's coming out of the office account. But very important that we still talk about fraud and wiring, and never that they will never get the instructions from you, only from the office or from the title company. You have a key exchange form. So at move-in, when the landlord and the tenant probably finally meet, this is a good form to acknowledge that the keys were exchanged on this particular date. Kind of reaffirms the dates that are on the lease. Typically, that happens on the first day the lease begins. If the landlord lets them in sooner, that's fine, as long as everybody's in agreement. Whether they're going to get charged or not charged is up to the landlord. But here you would put the type of keys that are exchanged too. So if they're getting a front door key, a side door key, a garage door opener, a fob electronic opener for the garage or main entry doors on a lot of the big high rises. They have electronic, so you can go in kind of keyless. Whatever's being exchanged should be noted, because ultimately in the lease it will provide that if they're lost or stolen, the tenant's responsible to reimburse the landlord for those expenses, and there'll be a charge for those. So it's just good to acknowledge the keys were exchanged and what kind of keys were exchanged on that particular date. This is for a sale and a lease. You can use this one. So again, lead-based paint. We have a specific lead-based paint that is used for the landlord when the house is built before 78. It's similar to the other form, but it just says landlord tenant on it, so it's more specific to a lease transaction. So this is a before 78. The after 78, again, is that we use the same form for buy or sell. Landlord tenant, so when it's after 78. So we've revised this so it says that at the top, seller landlord. When a house is built before 78, and have the tenant acknowledge it as well. So lead-based paint again with every transaction. So we do have a lease application, which I've revised to take out any personal information that shouldn't be transmitted over the internet. So that means driver's license, social security numbers, will not be transmitted over the internet ever in this office. So we just have you abbreviate them, last 4 or last 6 of the driver's license. Again, most of the time, hopefully you've got your landlord set up so they're doing this electronically. The tenant will not have to fill out this form most of the time. You can put this as an attachment on the MLS in case the landlord is not embracing the third-party vendor, so that the tenant can then fill it out. But there's a lot of information on here that typically you as the agent shouldn't be seeing. It's none of your business. This is between the landlord and the tenant. That's why I'm not a huge fan of these applications, because it has a lot of that person's personal information, how much they're making, all that kind of stuff. That's up to the landlord. But it's here in case you need it. Many brokerages are still using this, so don't be shocked when somebody says, "Well, fill out my application," and then you're putting in a whole social security number, or a whole. They want you to fill that out. You're not going to do that. You're just going to put a portion, and the rest the landlord can call the tenant to get the rest. You don't want to be the one transmitting that over the internet, because according to our attorney, we have to proceed under the premise that we're always being watched, that your email is hacked. And that's a good way to, when you look at things, that you got to keep that in your back of your mind, that that's happening. It happens all the time. You really don't know who else is seeing these documents. So our office policy is other offices don't care. Other agents say, hey, send me your client's credit report. We don't do that. We don't do that here. I'll have the tenant send it to you if you want it, but I don't want you guys handling any of that. That's none of your, that's again, it's none of your business. It's personal, confidential. We're not even allowed to keep it in the office when you get it, right? It's like, what happens if the cleaning lady gets it? There's all kind of stuff. So there's a lot more rules with the lease. I have created some lease instructions. This is how I handle a lease. Feel free to take this and modify it and create your own lease instructions. But I just tell them right out of the gate, listen, don't send me your client's credit report. People say, well, they already had they don't want to pull their credit again because it's going to ding their score. Well, that's not accurate. It's a minimal hit when anybody dings it again. But, if they're out there shopping furniture or buying a car, yeah, it's going to take a hit on their credit score. But the reality is everybody's expected to kind of shop things around a little bit, right? So we just kind of lay it out. Again, you can modify this, but it's good to have that so that the prospective tenant's agent can see that this is what you're going to require as part of it. And there's nothing out here that's out of whack. It's all legal. It's all fine. So this is just a suggestion. Okay. Then we have pet agreements. So, if you attended the class we had with Scott Galloway last week, really talked a lot about leases. A lot of discussion on pets and service animals, emotional support animals. Bottom line is you cannot discriminate any emotional support or service animal. So even if somebody had a pit bull and you weren't comfortable with that breed, if they had the certification, from service animal, of course, goes through a lot more documentation and training than an emotional support animal most of the time. But
what if the property has a stipulation on the breed?
Doesn't
How
matter.
do you handle that?
Doesn't matter. You cannot discriminate. We had this exact discussion, and I've got all kind of stuff I can share with you on the differences and why. And Scott gave us a great handout too, kind of like a flow chart on how things work. But the question was posed, what if you're in a condominium complex and they don't allow dogs or they don't allow any pets? You can't discriminate. Because first of all, service animal, the easiest way to think about it, performs a human function. So that person has some deficiency, and it's not like you and I might, there's something that person needs help with. So, obviously the ones that's more visible is leader dog for the blind, right? You see them all over. And in fact, our office, we help. They come to our office to walk the dogs down the stairs because we got a nice wide staircase and it's a little easier to maneuver. But they train the dogs during the nicer weather here. They'll bring them into the office when we actually hosted an event for them as a little bit of a fundraiser, which was nice. But that's typically what we'll see is whether it's somebody that's blind, somebody that's hearing impaired, somebody that's smell impaired. They do a variety of different human functions that particular individual might be lacking. And then unfortunately, many times these are veterans that were, somehow injured, damaged at why they were in service. So the pet, you can't charge any fees for a service animal or an emotional support animal. And emotional support has really become an abused portion of the real estate world. And as a landlord, I'm glad I don't have to deal with this anymore. Because I don't care how good you think your pet is, right? And I've had dogs. They're going to have an accident. They're going to get sick, guaranteed. So there's always going to be some type of damage, right? And depending on the person and how well they maintain those things, or people that work all day and come back, they're going to have accidents, right? So it's hard to say that, okay, I'm going to let 100-pound dog come into my home. There's going to be wear and tear on the house, right? It's going to tear up the yard, probably. It's going to discolor the yard with, whatever they're doing outside, right? And then, are they manicured properly? You got hardwood floors. There's so much that plays into that. So, and on the flip side of that, half the people have pets, right? So if you don't allow pets, you're cutting out half of your potential tenant pool, right? So that's the flip side of that. In fact, all three of my landlords right now are no pets, right? So that's hurting us too, especially now, right? But they're very adamant with that. So, we're holding the line, so forth. So here you talk about the pets, your responsibility as the owner. And this is if you were charging a deposit, if you're allowed to charge a deposit. Now, there's no rules on deposits. You can, if as long as it's not a service animal or a emotional support animal, you can discriminate breeds. Okay. There's some cities that even do that. The cities that prohibit certain breeds in their property, in their cities. You can also demand that they're licensed, right? I would be asking for that if I was somebody who's going to bring me any kind of pet or animal, service animal. They don't talk about a leader dog for the blind as a pet. They call it an animal, and that's a different kind of a classification again. So, so the ability to charge, and here's a crazy statistic. The second most popular emotional support animal is a Shetland pony, right? So how would you do that? Obviously there's city ordinances that would prohibit that in most suburban settings or urban settings, but that's a pretty popular emotional support animal is a Shetland pony. So the different dogs, different breeds, different sizes, again, other condo, they have all kind of rules, but the bottom line is, and here's your canned answer as the agent, is that, you should talk to an attorney. That's why I would, the landlord has a problem, like one of my I talked to him, he says somebody was expressed some interest and said, of course, they had an emotional support animal. And he said, well, I won't let you rent. And she fired back a little bit, and he came back to me, and I said, listen, I want to tell you flat out, you cannot deny. If she goes to the free legal aid, which they know, that most of them know the rules, how they get around this kind of stuff. And, you can get a doctor's note on the internet for $50, literally. So that's where I'm saying it's really been abused. But it is what it is, right? So that's where you make sure you're charging enough security deposit. You cannot charge a damage deposit for the pet, for the animal, the service animal or emotional support. You cannot charge any type of deposit. Now, typically what we see when you can charge a fee is a per month fee. Okay. So whether it's $20, $25 per pet per month, that's a good number. Or, I see people collect it all up front. I want $500 per pet for the year. That way you've got the money. That's a pretty good way to do it if the potential tenant has the funds to do all of that. But I've seen some crazy pet fees too. So pet fees, there's no, you can charge whatever you want, but there's always a chance when you go to court that the judge might think it's excessive. And at that point, they would, probably have some type of repercussions, and you might have to pay back some of it. But it's a lousy spot for a landlord to be in with the rules right now and how things are going, in my opinion. So, so this is just kind of defining everybody's role, pretty much picking up at, there's more local ordinances that, as far as picking up after your dog, different, condo complexes or site condos always have rules for that kind of stuff too. So, but here's a form that you can at least put to paper what kind of pet it is. So when there's a tenant occupying the property and it needs to be shown, this is very challenging, extremely challenging. So you must be in agreement, right? In most leases, there'll be a provision that prior to the expiration of the lease, usually within 30 days, that the tenant must cooperate to allow the showings to take place. That'll be in almost every lease. Now, whether or not the tenant does that or not is another story. So if they're not cooperative, it's going to be very challenging to rent a place while there's a tenant in it. They have to be in agreement. You cannot force it down their throat unless the landlord ends up going to court and getting a court order to demand that the tenant show the property. Typically, if you're 30 days out and they're not cooperating, I would tell the landlord, listen, let's just wait till they get out and then rent the place, because they're not going to cooperate. They're just going to make it difficult. We're going to have agents trying to schedule, they'll deny, and then, that gets everybody frustrated and upset, right? So had the discussion with the tenant, listen, the landlord should start that. We're going to put the property back on the market, and we need to be able to show the property. So what's convenient for you? And you would work around the tenant schedule. So if they're working midnights and they need to sleep between 8 and 4, well, that's going to be a challenge too, right? That happens. They got babies. That's a challenge, right? If they got elderly people they care for, things like that, that all plays into it. But they still have to cooperate, but you should be in agreement. So you're going to show that between 11 and 7, let's say. That's typical. So get the tenant's permission. Let them know that these items should be taken into consideration and probably removed from the property so they're not laying around. Similar as in a sale. Don't leave these things laying around. And then we talk about COVID. So everybody understands the risk. So during COVID, this was impossible. You couldn't show a property. And tenants were like, I don't blame them, right? So you had to wait till the tenant was either evicted or moved out. So this is what's important. We get it signed by the tenant, even though it's in the lease, that they're acknowledging that, yes, we should be showing the property. And then we have what to submit form, like we have for every major category. So you make sure you're in compliance. These are the forms I'm going to need as part of the lease transaction. So landlord, these are all the guys I need. Tenant, these are what I need. And if you got both, here's what I need. All right, last we've got 15, 20 minutes to go through the lease. So lease I've revised a few times. I like our lease a lot. It could be tweaked a little bit here and there, which eventually I'll probably get around to, but it is a little more tilted to the landlord, like most leases are, because it's obviously their property. But you can't discriminate, and you can't put in a lease something that prohibits the tenant's ability to do any type of legal action against you. Can't make them sign that, right? So what I see too often is landlords wanting to use their lease. And now we're involved as the brokerage, right? So I've got a problem with that because, I'm not an attorney. I know most of the statutes, but I don't want to go through this guy's whole lease and find out he's missing 5 provisions in the statutes that must be in every lease, because then we're not going to say we're not going to use it. Okay. So our lease is compliant. Our lease has all the provisions that a lease should have. It's not discriminatory in any way. Again, it's tilted a little more in the landlord's favor because they're the owner of the property, but it's still fair for both parties. So this is simple enough. Fill out the top part as usual. Typically, the lease is going to be for 1 year or more. Here in Royal Oak, we get into and even downtown Detroit, because of the pro athletic teams, we'll have a lot of the athletes who want to rent for 6 to 8 months, which is fine. But then how am I handling the commission? I tell my landlords up front, listen, if you take a lease less than a year, then I still expect to get paid a half a month's rent because I'm doing the same work, maybe even more. So that's okay to, if that's what the landlord wants, but again, comes with that realizing that in 8 months we're putting the house back on the market or to lease again. So, and then what's the expectation on the other tenant, on the tenant's side, the agent? What are they expecting to make? Some people will do, if you lease for 6 months, they'll do half of a half. I'm like, well, I'm not doing that. If you want to take that, I'm under no obligation to give them any more than half a month's rent. So whatever the rent is, again, keep in mind that would be, you have to have that in your verbiage, that's for a 1-year lease. Anything less will be renegotiated as far as the commission. Okay. Otherwise, you're stuck paying a half a month's rent. So, and conversely, if I get a 3-year lease, do I have an opportunity to get paid for every year of the lease? Yeah, as long as you put it in the contract. So you can do that. I've done that with tenants, with landlords that had a tenant sign up for 3 years. Well, I don't care about the tenant's agent. They don't got to know any of this stuff. Since I negotiated on my exclusive right to sell. For the first year, I get a half month's rent. For the second year, I get a half month's rent. And for the third year, I get a half month's rent. And the landlord's usually fine with paying that because they don't have to pay the other half. And you found them a 3-year tenant. So that's not turning over. There's not more repairs needed, more painting needed, things like that. So those are options. Or you can just say, listen, that's my gift. Like these guys, I've had 16 years, literally four different landlords, 16 years I've had them. So sometimes I won't charge them because I get their business all the time. But that's, it's discretionary. So when you do the lease, here, the top part, you do the total amount of the lease. So if you're going to do for a lease, wait. Did I lose you guys? Jeff, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right, because the power went out here for a minute. So are you seeing on the screen still the lease?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so top part, you would put the total dollar amount for the duration of the lease was, if it's $1,000 a month for 12 months, it's $12,000 was here. Monthly installments of $1,000 per month. And then when is the lease going to start? So typically we start the lease on the first of a month is ideal. It's easier for everybody to wrap their arms around and remember when the rent is due. But sometimes somebody needs to move in right away, maybe in the middle of the month, towards the end of the month. So there'll be a portion of 1 month plus you'll have the full month for the next month. So what I like to see happen is we always collect at least 1 month. So this first month you can do, let's say like today's the 21st. Somebody was moving in today, we'd say the rent is paid from 11/21 to 12/21. And then we let the landlord collect the extra 10 days or 9 days, whatever the month is, that's still due for that portion of the month, right? Or if it's something that small, typically most people will just go along with you collecting it now. So we'll collect say 10 days for November plus all of December up front. That way the tenant's paid for all the way till the end of the year. It's easier for everybody to, again, remember, figure out, cipher, whatever. It's easier for people to grasp. So first of the month is always easier to do, and you prorate accordingly. This is a provision that must be in every lease. And ironically, this year, somebody came to me with a lease. It's a friend of theirs, and they had an issue and they wanted me to look at it. And I said, well, I'm not an attorney, but I'll look at it. And sure enough, this provision was missing. So I told them, I said, well, tenant, go to court. I said, I'm sure the judge will throw it out because the statute's there. And sure enough, they did. So I bought the tenant another couple of months before they could get re-evicted, or at least time to move out properly. So we need to know where we're going to send the rent. So sometimes, you have a property manager, it might not be the same. We encourage everyone to agree to do wires as part of the rent moving forward, so that electronically the tenant can pay the rent, whether it's direct deposit or whether it's, do you use Venmo or do you use Zelle, right? I mean, those are okay, but it's not as good as getting a direct deposit. And the problem is once you open up that can of worms, if the tenant got behind and you ended up going to court for the money portion, the 7-day writ, they could send you $1 and it would throw off all the timelines. So you want to shut that kind of stuff down if you're going to be evicting somebody, that you don't, or you're not accepting that anymore as payment, because that could throw off your whole schedule, and then you'd have to, the clock gets reset and you got to start all over again. So where are we sending the rent? Is it a property manager? Is it going to the landlord? The landlord going to their house? Many times the landlord should set up like a PO box, so they're not going to their house directly. Application, of course, the tenant's going to fill out an application, and we talked about that enough during that process. Default, a tenant can default at any time. The tenant can say, I want to move out, but they're going to be breaking the lease. The lease is a contract. So the contract is you're obligated to pay the rent during these 12 months. So if you want to move out after 6 months, that's great. But you're going to be responsible for that rent until it's either re-rented or the 12 months is up. And you can get sued for the balance, right? So again, that's where it's important that you get a good security deposit, you're in agreement, and sometimes it happens. We do not have a transfer clause in our lease. Some leases do. I took it out because I think it's getting abused again, where people were using that as a way to get out of a lease, and then you'd have to verify it and all that. So you sign a lease for 12 months, you're locked in for 12 months, pros and cons, right? So the landlord can't throw you out either. Okay, he has to honor the lease. And if you break the lease, you're going to have consequences. And some of the leases will have provisions in there on what happens. Automatically it's a $2,000 charge, and you're still going to get paid because, if I'm the landlord, it's like, wait a minute, you break the lease. I just paid these realtors 6 months ago. Now I got to pay them again. So I'm going to incur those costs are going to be part of what the tenant's going to have to reimburse me for, because those were, not really supposed to happen if the lease was followed. So that could be part of the additional expenses that the landlord would get from the security deposit. Who pays what utility? Sounds simple enough, right? But make it clear what happens. And gas, electric is usually flows with the tenant. If it's a condo, obviously that could be different. It could be part of the monthly dues. But the biggest thing is who pays the water bill. And in single family homes, I always felt that tenant should have some of that responsibility or all of it. But when you put the burden on the tenant as a landlord, you have to make sure that it's being paid. So how do I do that? So, now it's a lot easier. Many of the cities have online. You can check, see what the balance is, see if it's been paid. Nice, hunky-dory. Other cities are still operating before Christ. They're horrible. It's hard to get a reading. You can't get a reading for 3 weeks. They don't send you a bill for a month. So every city is really different. Most of them are, getting into the modern era a little bit where you can see this stuff electronically. But even though the tenant might sign an affidavit that they're going to be responsible, the city of Detroit allows the tenant to sign an affidavit that they're responsible to pay the water bill. But the bottom line is, if they don't pay the bill, the city's going to come after everybody. They're going to want their money. So are they going to go after and sue the tenant? Probably not. Are they going to put a lien on your house as a landlord? Maybe. And then you would have to go after the tenant. So that all sounds hunky-dory, but the bottom line is usually the burden falls back on the landlord. So you got to make sure the bill's being paid. So you're going to check with the municipality whatever way you can. You're going to ask for a receipt. I like to collect more money than the rent. So if my rent's $1,000, I'm going to collect $1,050. So I'll apply that 50 every month to the water bill. And whatever the balance is at the end of the billing cycle will be applied to the next bill. Or if you owe me money, you're going to owe me money then. I'm not going to wait to the end of the lease to try to secure that money. So the water bill is tricky how that's handled, but you got to stay on top of it. Otherwise, I've seen crazy water bills. Not so much as a landlord, but on resales, just will blow your head off. So then there's late fees. If you're late, we have a pretty strong late fee in our lease because we do more high-end leases. So that's why they're $100. We used to leave them blank, but most agents didn't know what to put in here, and they were asking the questions. So between the half a dozen agents that do a lot of loft business, this is the numbers that we plugged in. If you're chronically late, this is what happens. The rent could go up. Here we talk about the security deposit. And part of the security deposit statute, this is a little weird. You have to put where the money's going to be deposited. So again, a landlord that's getting good professional advice will know that they have to keep those funds separate. You cannot commingle them with your personal funds, but a lot of the onesie-twosie landlords, as I call them, are commingling. And so you still need to know, where are you going to put that money? You say, well, what can I do? What possibly can I do with that? Well, God forbid something happens to the landlord. At least you have somewhat of an idea, hopefully, where they put the money, that you could, trace it back, and who's ever dealing with the estate or whatever that's handling the account now for the landlord can somewhat come to an agreement that, that he had that money and it was deposited on this date. That's why you're doing certified funds too, by the way. There'll be some government rules. You have to adhere to that. We revised this paragraph a few years back once the legalization and normalization of marijuana is taking place. So a tenant now cannot smoke anything, tobacco or marijuana, in a property. So the landlord has a right to do that. Before it was medical marijuana, there was some gray area whether or not that was allowed in a property, but the bottom line, it's not. So, from a landlord's perspective, right, all these things can create a lot of damage if it's allowed to happen in your property, especially if there's any type of membrane in there, like drapery, carpeting, and even wood cabinetry can absorb those smells. So, and then it's hard to get those smells out. They're not allowed to grow in a rental situation without the landlord's permission. And as a landlord, I never allowed that. But so this kind of defines the smoking and vaping, tobacco and not. Is a really good paragraph regarding that situation. So you can charge a non-refundable preparation fee here with the landlord as part of the lease. This can flow a number of different ways. You can charge the tenant. It's going to pay this fee, and then it could flow back to the landlord, or this is additional monies that you would get as part of the lease, depending on how you define it. Personal property, typically this would be the appliances that are included in the sale, unless you're leasing something that's furnished, at which point I would encourage you to have an additional attachment to the lease with all the furnishings. Like I have a loft, he had, all you had to do was unpack your bags. It was pretty much like an Airbnb, even better. You had wine glasses, shot glasses, you had fully stocked spices. You even have an opening refrigerator for these people when they move in, because he was getting $3,000 a month. It was a nice lease. But he had everything inventorized. So that move out, he knew if the one wine glass was broken, he knew that, and he would charge the tenant accordingly and not release the security deposit until it was paid off. Keys, the charges in case they're lost or stolen. Entry by the landlord, even though you own the property, you cannot go in without permission. So once you turn over those keys, you've got to have the tenant's permission, or it has to be a police event that you're able to, or a 24-hour emergency event. Like if you knew the heat went out and they were gone, you want to protect your property. If you knew there was a water leak and water's coming out of the basement window, those kind of, you can go in and protect the property. But it's always good, if ever you do that, is to have somebody with you, so you have a witness on what took place. Because if you went in and all of a sudden the tenant says, "Hey, I'm missing my grandma's diamond ring," now we got a problem, right? So it's good to have a witness. Somebody can collaborate with your story and how you did and why you did it. But again, you need permission, and this is hard for landlords to grasp sometimes. Worst case scenario, you talk to the local police department if you have to gain entry, and they will be there to assist you. For sale signs and that are quite often they're not allowed in condo complexes. They don't want you to put any signs for sale or for lease. Maintenance, we talk about who's responsible for what, and this is very critical. So is a landlord going to maintain the lawn, landscaping, snow removal, tenant? So you describe who's going to pay what, who's going to do what. As a landlord, there's a couple things that I would never ask a tenant to do. And that one is clean the gutters. I think this is extremely risky that you're asking the tenant to get up on a ladder, in most cases, to clean the gutters. That's an accident waiting to happen and a potential lawsuit waiting to happen. So these things should be built in your rent. I always felt as a landlord that, listen, I'm going to pay a company to come out here at least twice a year, clean the gutters. Are you okay with that? Nobody's going to tell you no. And that's another way to kind of eyeball the property too. The other thing is here with batteries and smoke detectors, I would tell my tenants, listen, I'm going to come in the spring and the fall when we change the clocks forward, move back, whatever. Then I'm going to change the batteries in your smoke detectors and I'm going to change the filters in your furnace. Are you okay with that? No one ever tells you no. So it's another way to, again, get into the property, look around, make sure it's okay, make sure they're living like you would hope they would live and they're not going to have any health and safety issues. Those are different ways to just check out the property legally, right? Who pays for what repair? Some leases, you have to be very careful. They want the tenant to pay the first $100 of every repair, right? So I always have a problem with that. In our lease, we've structured it so that right here, any repairs costing $100 shall be paid by the tenant. All repairs more than $100 must be approved in writing by the landlord, except, okay, if it's like the heating and cooling system, a hot water tank, in-wall sewer lines, roof leaks, structural damages, main sewer line from the house, if not tenant related, will be done by the landlord. Those are the landlord's property. That's the landlord's infrastructure. Appliances, same thing. Why is the tenant going to pay $100 to fix your refrigerator? And it could be, 10 years old. It could be something that happens every year and needs Freon. Why am I paying for that, right? It's your refrigerator. If it's something I did, if I damaged, my kid hung on the door and he broke the door, I got to pony up for that. That's something that happened. But the routine maintenance of things, and this is where some of the tenants really get stiffed, that they have to pay for the first $100. Why am I going to pay $100 for you to fix your furnace? I just don't get it, right? So anyway, be careful of that. Ours is, again, tilted towards a tenant at this point. This is very tenant friendly, this paragraph, where, we don't have them pay these fees. Some landlords don't like that this is in there. Well, that's too bad. Find another lease. Hold harmless, insurance. Good rule of practice for the landlord. Listen, you need to charge renters. You need to make sure your tenant has renter's insurance. You need to be named insured so that if they cancel, you will know. And they're just covering their personal property in there, right? And you're obviously insuring the building and the grounds, the structure, but they need to cover their personal content. And many high rises now will not even allow you to move in until you've proven that you have that renter's insurance, which is smart. The tenant has, again, usually 30 days, you're going to give notice prior to the termination of the lease that you're going to be moving out. Don't assume that you can hold over. That needs to be agreed to, that maybe the landlord doesn't want to keep you there. Maybe the landlord wants to raise their rent dramatically and wants you out. Again, you're there for 12 months or 24, 36, whatever it is. But anything beyond that, you need to get out in a timely fashion. You are entitled to the quiet enjoyment of your property. So I've had this invoked one time in my career where the tenant, it was in a high rise here, and it was one of the ones that are stick built, and horrible noise transfer. You could hear your neighbor doing a lot of things you shouldn't be hearing throughout the building at any times of the day, right? So there was a lot of noise that was being back and forth in here that really made it uncomfortable for this particular tenant, because he needed to sleep. When the times that he was supposed to sleep, somebody was like more active during the early morning hours. And, and every city has a noise ordinance. So usually between 7 a.m. and 11 p.m., noise is something you're not going to get a knock on the door from the police. But after that, and during that time, you could get, the police to tell you to tone it down or shut it down. So they invoked this paragraph and were able to move out without any penalties because it was legit. And here, let me speed through this. Abandonment. So tenant takes off. Landlord has a right to secure his property and re-rent it. Good rule of thumb from the landlord's perspective is, listen, once somebody's out, they owed you money and they didn't tell you they were moving out. Once you've determined that they're out, you should send that tenant a certified letter to the address. If they didn't provide a forwarding address at that time, usually they don't, but you send a certified letter to your address and inevitably it'll go to the tenant because everybody's going to put their forwarding address. Everybody wants to get their mail and what you've done and how you're outlining and how you're going to handle any security deposit that still might be out there. Now, keep in mind, the security deposit is to be used only for damages. It can only be used for rent if you're in agreement or in a default. So typically you would talk to an attorney to find out how you're going to handle that monies, but you have to give them a written notice on, I'm taking, if the security deposit's $1,500, I'm going to take $200 to fix the damaged door. I'm going to take $300 to fix the window, whatever the damages they might have done. And then I'm keeping the rest because you were delinquent in your rent. Now, you cannot take money out of security deposits to clean the carpets. Okay, that's maintenance. That's normal wear and tear. That can be done with an additional cleaning fee. You can charge a cleaning fee. And that's why, a lot of people do that particularly if a house has carpeting. I don't care how careful you are, probably after a year, you're gonna have to clean the carpets, right? Especially if they're any kind of lighter color. And if you have pets and so forth. So how the deposit is handled and who handles the deposit, the best advice you're always going to give is you should talk to an attorney. Okay. That's the best advice you're going to get, especially anything with these pets related and pet fees, security deposits. If there's a default, if you got to be evicted, you're going to always do that through an attorney. I would think I would never go down there again. I used to do it myself. And I really learned the hard way by observing and saying, listen, I'm never going to do this again. I'm hiring an attorney, and that was the best money I ever spent. That I always had an attorney when I went to eviction court. Lead-based paint, and the move-in checklist. These are two statutes. This is right here. It talks about the truth in renting and the security deposit notice. As I talked about, within the tenant is responsible to notify the landlord within 4 days of moving a forwarding address. If the tenant doesn't provide that address, really all bets are off. Okay, the landlord doesn't have any obligation. But we talked to the attorney last week. It's good practice to still send a letter to the address of the property they were renting, and the name of the tenant, and outline what you're going to do with that security deposit. If you're going to use it towards damages, you're going to keep it for past rent. The landlord must respond in writing. And this is the statute. If the landlord doesn't respond in writing within 30 days, it could be up as much as triple indemnity. So if the security deposit was $1,500, tenant could sue and be able to probably get up to $4,500 from that landlord. So there's all timelines that come into place. So the landlord has 30 days to get the letter. The tenant gets the letter. They have 7 days to respond. And after that, the landlord has 3 more days to respond. So all these rules is that's why you hire an attorney. It's costly, but you want to make sure you're doing it right. You want to make sure nobody crosses any lines they're not supposed to be crossing. So this text, you can see it's different than this text. By statute, it has to be 4 font size bigger than most of the body of the rest of the lease. So if you can see that this is 8, let's say, and these are 12s. Well, that's the statute. If it's the same font size, the judge can throw out the lease when a smart attorney is going to pick all that stuff up. So these are little things, and again, our lease is compliant for the most part. We last revised it in 2000. Here's a closing checklist. We do have also an additional closing settlement sheet, but this is a way where you put the monies, have everybody acknowledge what the monies are going to be handled and where they're going to be handled, how they're going to be handled, whether you're prorating rent, any non-refundable fees, any pet fees, any cleaning fees, things like that would all be documented here. So we made that part of the lease so you don't forget to do it. All right, I'll ask here, any questions on this? Because I went through this a little quicker than I wanted to, but try to get through before 3 o'clock, but I went over. Gave you a lot of stuff today. So read this stuff, take the time out. You can go into a Remind or DocuSign and download these documents and, just get comfortable with them. If you want to create a fake transaction, again, send it to me as the tenant or the landlord. I'd be happy to interact with you on that. But this gives you a little bit of getting your feet wet about landlord tenant and all the issues. It's not as simple. It's actually almost to me a harder transaction than a sale because we deal with the before, the during, and the after is part of a lease. Where typically in a sale you don't deal with the after at all. So anyway, that's it for me today. I'll see you guys. Have a blessed Thanksgiving. Enjoy the family. I will be back on Monday the 28th. All right. Take care. Have a great day.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank
All
you,
right.
Steve.
See you guys.
Bye.